Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast, as we are now going to be diving into this week's Week 0 college football action. Very limited slate this past weekend, and yet we still got a handful of very fun, surprising moments that we're going to have a lot to look forward to this college football season. But obviously the headliner out of this was the first game of the slate, with the Florida State Seminoles facing the Georgia Tech Golden Jackets, and we saw our first upset of the season, a number 10 Florida State team falling on a walk-off field goal from Georgia Tech to lose 24-21. And it was just an incredible way, really, for college football fans to kick off this season, seeing sort of some of the mayhem, at least, that is going to occur. That being said, though, not an incredible way to start the season for Florida State. And it was coming into this year an off-season full of drama of the Seminoles missing the playoffs after an undefeated season. They are getting into legal disputes with the ACC about what the future of them and the conference looks like. That this year was supposed to be sort of the revenge tour, them coming back to show the world that they were wrong to leave them out of the playoffs last year and that they're still one of the best teams. It's not exactly fair to frame it that way, because obviously tons of turnover from last season to this year. But that being said, there should have been no short of motivation for Florida State to come out and set the tone early on in the season. And instead, they drop one to maybe a Georgia Tech team that could be more competitive than people were anticipating. But that being said, a bad loss for Florida State. In this game taking place in Ireland, I understand weird circumstances. You're traveling, you're taking a bunch of college kids who are getting this incredible experience to go to Ireland. They're playing a team that they should definitely beat in Georgia Tech. The focus wasn't there. I think that that's a little bit of an indictment against the coaching staff. But obviously in this game, especially on social media, all of the attention was sort of turned to DJ Uiagalelei, the Florida State quarterback transferring in from Oregon State, and he was pretty mediocre in this game. And if you are, a lot of people were still having these high expectations for DJU, which comes from the fact that he once was a 5-star, and the first time we really got to see him was during that COVID season, him coming in against Notre Dame, throwing for, I think it was 5 touchdowns. But it's been pretty clear since then that Uiagalelei isn't that level. He can be a solid college football quarterback, which I think that he still is, and that's where I think people get lost, because DJ did not lose this game for Florida State. Obviously, if you were holding him to that former 5-star standard, you came away disappointed, and this was a little bit of a rude awakening for you. But I don't think he was bad in this game. 19 of 27, 193 yards. Ultimately, he kind of did what they asked him to do. They didn't ask him necessarily to do all that much, where it was a lot of short stuff. His accuracy wasn't elite by any means, but he was hitting wide receivers, whether they were perfect throws or not. They were able to move the chains at least somewhat through the air. But I think that ultimately, he definitely left a lot of things to be desired, especially on the deep passes. That's where, when you talk about the progression of DJU over these past few seasons, you're going to be disappointed, because that arm talent hasn't evolved in the way we were anticipating. But again, I do think more times than not, he makes the right plays. He puts balls, at least he puts his receivers in a good position to at least have a play on it. And ultimately, when he walked off the field for the last time, it was a tie game. That last drive of his, I think, was sort of the epitome of what DJ is at this point. He had his share of mistakes, misreading a play, throwing to the wrong guy, but being able to bounce back and convert on a 3rd and long. He just sort of missed the mark, but he just kept responding to all of these mistakes. There were multiple 4th and longs on that drive that DJ and Florida State were able to pick up. But, and drive all the way down the field and score a touchdown to tie the game with 6 minutes and 33 seconds left. Usually in that situation, you feel like you're going to get another chance to either come back and have to put another drive together with your back against the wall, or that you have a chance to just straight up win it. And instead, DJ got neither, because that Georgia Tech team just kept running down the throats of Florida State. It was not a perfect drive by any means from Georgia Tech, but they killed clock. And as they were, they end up getting into field goal range, they almost blew it because of a fumbled snap. But, even then, able to make up that yardage, get into field goal range, and then a field goal from Aiden Burr, 44-yarder, sends the Seminoles back to America with a loss. We have a comment here from a Miami Hurricanes fan. He said, as a Hurricanes fan, I laughed when I heard Florida State lose and Georgia Tech because last year they were trolling us after we lost to the same team in the same way. Well, Miami definitely last year suffered their share of brutal losses. A little bit of a state rivalry there as well between Florida State and Miami. So 100% I understand from you, Anthony, that you are allowed to sort of laugh in the face of Florida State a little bit in this one, especially with, arrogance can be a good thing for a football team, but Florida State was pretty arrogant about the way they went across the end of the season last year as well. Sort of I don't know if you want to call it entitlement, but, having that undefeated record, everybody that watched football understood the idea that they were not a top 4 team. And, I don't even want to go into that whole debate right now because we're moving on to a new year this year. But definitely very disappointing for Florida State after all of that drama that took place at the end of last season to come out flat in this way. Very disappointing there. But, again, sort of wrapping up the thoughts here on DJ. I thought he played fine. He's not the reason why they lost this game. He's nowhere near the player that people were hoping him to be when, especially at Clemson, during that point, Deshaun Watson, Trevor Lawrence, DJU was supposed to be the next guy, and instead just sort of flamed out there, and he's been sort of, I wouldn't even say struggling to pick up the pieces since then. He had a good season at Oregon State last year. He's capable of still having another good year this season at Florida State, but a brutal loss. But like I mentioned, I don't put this game on him. I think that this came down to the line of scrimmage and Florida State losing in the trenches, because when you look at the fact that, DJ was facing pretty heavy blitzes throughout the entire game, and even more so importantly, you just look at the differences in rush yards. 190 for Georgia Tech, 98 versus Florida State. After that opening drive touchdown from the Seminoles, they really weren't getting much on the run game. Now, I think it's definitely still possible for them to be able to respond because they have a number of talented running backs in that locker room, but they're going to need some help from their offensive line. And defensively, that was their entire identity, really, especially once Jordan Travis went down back in the 2023 season. For them to get pushed around the way that they did was, frankly, a little bit embarrassing for them. And Georgia Tech is a very good rushing offense, but that was a very big concern for me in terms of Florida State. Very quickly here, because I do want to sort of flip the page here and get into some of Georgia Tech, but, as for Florida State's playoff hopes, I don't think that the committee is going to hold a week 0 loss, walk-off loss to Georgia Tech in Ireland fully against them, it's a bad look, 100%. I think it's something that Florida State can respond from, especially with how forgiving this 12-team format is, but they're definitely going to have their work cut out for them. But like I mentioned, want to give Georgia Tech some credit here, and I think that ultimately, Haynes King is a quarterback that led the ACC in passing yards last year. He was very hit or miss, though, was second in the entire country in interceptions, but he provides some versatility to that run game as well, and I thought that he was very solid in this. Not much of a downfield threat in terms of letting it loose on the deep ball, but was still able to hit all the stuff underneath, 11 of 16, 146 yards, and was very impactful in the run game as well, where he had 54 yards. So I thought that was a really nice upside for Georgia Tech and this Golden Jackets team to be able to week 0, technically, I was going to say week 1, come out, establish that they are still the team that can move the ball on the ground as well as anybody in the ACC, and depending on how this year goes, maybe even the country as a whole. Anthony, like I said, I did sort of already touch on your comment. As a Miami fan, you should be able to laugh at Florida State a little bit based off of, that interstate division or that interstate rivalry and such, interconference rivalry has all the makings for it. But, that being said, Miami also with their share of tough losses last year. But I also want to touch here on the SMU-Nevada game. SMU making their debut as a member of the ACC. Just talked about Florida State, talked about Georgia Tech, talked about Haynes King maybe sort of inserting himself and making a name for himself a little bit more on a big stage. And there's another quarterback as well that maybe could have established himself a little bit in the conference, and that was Preston Stone. And it was not a pretty start for him. His first pass was an interception. He was 3 of 10 in the first half as a whole, but down the stretch, I thought that he was really impressive. Him and RJ Maryland, crazy game. I believe it was 6 receptions, over 160 receiving yards. Him and Stone definitely seemed to have a connection there. SMU was running with a couple different quarterback looks, but it was Stone down the stretch, letting that deep ball go. Again, primarily to Maryland, but I thought that it was a very impressive job from him. SMU, they were something like 27-point favorites headed into this game against Nevada, and they ended up being way closer than it should have. Took this Preston Stone comeback to be able to put it together. So SMU, again, little bit of a scare there on the road against Nevada, but able to, reel it back in, put together some impactful drives at the end of this game. Got the run game going a little bit as well, which was encouraging to see from them. And, going to be very interesting to monitor going forward how SMU is able to hang in there with the best of the ACC. But we, again, just week 0 in college football. Not too many headliner games. There were a number of other good games as well. The Montana State comeback was also very impressive. But, whole lot more action to get into as these weeks come on here. Very much looking forward to it. But we are now going to be taking a quick break, and when we come back on the other side, we're going to be switching gears back to the NFL, where I want to give some thoughts on the performance from Bryce Young, where we finally got to see him play in his first game ahead of the 2024 season. A crucial year. We'll break down what we saw this past weekend and sort of what it could mean and what pressure lies on Bryce Young for this upcoming season. So we will dive into that. But first, a quick break. Do not go anywhere. We will be right back.